Aaron, thank you very much. I got so choked up I couldn't sing. Maybe we'll get my emotions clear enough so we can have a little preaching. John, the disciple Jesus loved, I think it's John, the writer of the gospel, outruns old Peter, gets to the tomb, and is hesitant, but peeks in, and he sees. He sees and he trusts. He sees and he believes. What difference does such a belief make? In practical terms, what difference does believing that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead? Some people go through life living through the prism of fear and worry and always lack the courage of conviction because they are scared of what's coming. But when death is defeated in Jesus Christ and in His resurrection, people can read the signs and begin living through a prism of trust. Amen? That's what I want to do. I don't want to live worrying and afraid. I want to live with trust. I want to see and believe. So many people see and are afraid. John goes in and he believes, but that's not what has happened in the previous chapters of John's gospel. So much of what John writes is unique from all of the other gospels. And I want today to look at John chapter 18 and verse 28, and I want to pick up the story after Jesus has been arrested. He's been tried in the Sanhedrin. He's gone to Annas and then to the high priest Caiaphas. He's then been carted across from the place of the Sanhedrin in the temple, close to the temple proper, and they moved to the north side of the Temple Mount. Aaron, next slide. That way you can imagine this maybe a little better. Yeah, just to the north side of the temple complex, you see the big building over there is the praetorium. This is not Herod, but Pilate's quarters. And Fortress Antonia is attached to that. And so they take Jesus from these areas over to the far side of the picture to Fortress Antonia. And then the Jews, 1828, led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews didn't enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. I just wonder how that made the Gentile governor feel. And so Pilate came out to them and asked. They didn't go to Pilate. Pilate had to go out to them, see. And what charges are you bringing against this man? If he weren't a criminal, they replied, we wouldn't have handed him over to you. Pilate said, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone The Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die would be fulfilled. And Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it that you have done?" "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest." They fight to prevent my arrest from the Jews. "But now my kingdom is from, at least as of now, the kingdom is from another place." "Well, you are then a king," said Pilate. And Jesus answered, "You're right in saying that I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What's truth?" Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews, and he said, I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover, and do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had led a rebellion. And then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him on the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I'm bringing him out. I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." And when Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Behold, here is the man." And as soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." And when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. And he went back inside to the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." And from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." And when Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. And finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. If you read Josephus, you know that Pilate has a history of being a pretty poor leader. And one of the things that jumps out to me in this passage, maybe it does to you too, you look at a guy like Pilate and you see immediately that he is afraid of responsibility. He's afraid of responsibility. His responses to the Jews' demands, they seem to fail him. They continue to demand that he crucify Jesus. And he says in 1838 and in 1905, "You take him and crucify him. I find no basis for a charge." But in the end, there is not even a ruling. There's not even a decree. He just says, "Go on." Many people go through life trying to avoid responsibility. Yeah? You work with anybody that just wants to shift the responsibility off to somebody else? Many people go through life trying to avoid responsibility for big and little decisions. They don't want to take the big shot. They don't want to choose the restaurant. That's aggravating, isn't it? Why don't you choose the restaurant? Well, if you want me to unpack it, I don't choose the restaurant because I often choose a real dud, and the food is terrible, and we have to wait, especially on holidays, we have to wait an hour for the food, and then when it's all said and done, I'm responsible for having made a bad choice. Folks sometimes want to stay out of all that so that if the shot doesn't go in, or if the food stinks, or if the ministry initiative or the job initiative doesn't work out, then they can blame somebody else. And I think that is the motivating factor for Pilate all the way through this. He's trying to avoid taking a clear political stand. Pilate is also afraid to be self-revealing or frank or intimate with Jesus. I mean, he goes through the motions of saying, "Okay, Jesus, I want a private interview with you." And so they take him back within the halls of his own personal residence. They take him back, and yeah, he's got some guards there, but it's just he and Jesus. It's not like it's like in a formal courtroom setting. He takes him back into his own house. comes and asks Jesus if he's the king of the Jews, something that others have accused him of, or of claiming of being the king of the Jews anyway. But Pilate, while pretty unwise and an unrestrained kind of leader, knew perfectly well that Jesus was threatening the hold of the popular imagination, right? The popular imagination, that the hold that the priests had on them. That's what Jesus is doing. But he puts the question to Jesus anyway. Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus wants to know, though, is that what you think? Is that what you think? Or are you just listening to everybody else? And Pilate dodges the question. He doesn't answer Jesus. He says, am I a Jew? Right? What kind of stake do I have in y'all's religious questions? He wants to keep the conversation at a kind of distance. Just tell me what you've done. Just tell me what you've done to make them mad. But Jesus isn't playing Pilate's game either. He simply tells him that his kingship, if it were like that of worldly kings, his followers would fight. His followers would try to subvert the governing authority. We would try to take charge forcibly. But that's not the kind of kingdom that I'm talking about. Pilate's afraid of responsibility. Pilate's afraid of any kind of self-revealing conversation with Jesus, and he's afraid of transcendent truths. He's afraid of any concept of truth to which he and everybody else are held accountable. Are you with me? When Jesus tells Pilate, everyone on the side of truth listens to me, that sounds like somebody just telling us that what he wants and what he is claiming, well, we ought to just kowtow to that because that's what he wants us to believe. And Pilate spoke for many of my generation and the generation before me, right? Pilate spoke for them who came to believe that morality was just something that individuals concoct up and make up for themselves. If it doesn't fit your groove, Aaron, make up your own. That's how it works. I would like to say that I'm glad that that way of thinking has fallen out of fashion in this generation. But Pilate didn't want to hear any of that moral principle stuff and about how things were true, whether or not you like it or not. Any transcendent value that he would have to bow to. That all he seems to know is who's in power, and truth for him is whatever Caesar says. And that ends the first interview. Pilate goes back out on the balcony of the praetorium. Aaron, just advance that one time. Pilate goes back out on the balcony of the praetorium. And I notice that he's just afraid of the people. He starts trying to bargain with them, starting to use this convention of how the Jews typically wanted to have the Romans release prisoners. He's afraid of their criticism, and he needs their cooperation to keep the peace, and so his decisions were always conditioned by trying to pacify the authorities. They're always conditioned by trying to get their approval in some way. And I think that's probably why they disrespect him and he disrespects them. Before my dad died nearly 30 years ago, he lamented the deterioration of the public schools, and he put it this way. He said, the teachers are afraid of the school administration. He said, the school administration is afraid of the parents. The parents are afraid of the kids, and the kids are afraid of nobody. I've watched kids, and they're afraid of their peers. They're afraid of their peers. They often go along to get along in all kinds of morally compromising ways, and in the more extreme cases, they seek attention in some really unhealthy ways, all as a part of trying to gain some kind of acceptance and feeling of home within a world that's often kind of cutthroat among peers. Pilate has a very human disease then. He needs approval, and getting approval is more important than his integrity. And so the Jewish authorities are just really manipulating him. They're not playing fair. They really have no interest in keeping the peace. They'd rather have Barabbas released, Barabbas who did lead an insurrection. Yeah. And they'd much rather have that. And so this whole thing is a kind of facade, and Pilate knows it. Their concern is just forcing Pilate's hand, making him take responsibility for Jesus, even though he doesn't want to do it. And after this bargaining doesn't work, Pilate tries another tactic. He either returns to Jesus, or he takes Jesus back into the praetorium with him. And he has the Roman guards beat him, mockingly dress him in royal robes, crown him with thorns. And so I notice then that his fear leads him to abuse and shame those whom he perceives as threats. He's going to not only abuse Jesus, scorn Jesus, but he's going to use Jesus as a way of mocking the whole crowd that's accusing Jesus. Taking Jesus back out to the crowd in this kind of condition, this bloody, beaten condition, is only an attempt to appeal to the natural sympathy of a few on one hand, and to satiate some of the bloodlust of Jesus' enemies on the other. And he brings him out and he says, "Behold the man. Look at the man." This doesn't translate well in English and in our theology. What he's saying, here is the representative person. Here is the representative man, the Son of Man, the man who represents Israel. This is, look at the country. Here he is. Can you believe that this guy is really being accused of being the king that's threatening Rome? Is that what you're really saying? Okay, well, I'll play along. There he is. Here is Israel. There's the man. The irony, of course, is that this is who Jesus is. He's Israel's representative head, Israel's man, Israel's true priest and king. But Pilate attempts to make the authorities in there rent a crowd. He tries to make them look stupid for being scared of a man so weakened and bloodied and scorned and abused. Pilate is saying, behold, look, he's not a threat. He's not leading a rebellion. Let him go. Beating him and dressing him up as a mock king is an attempt not at having to make a political decision. Do you want me to kill your king? This is your guy. This is what I essentially think of you Jews. Look, there he is. Later they would complain, don't say that this is the king of the Jews, rather that he claimed to be the king of the Jews. No, what I have written, I have written. I'm insulting you on purpose because you know what you're doing and I know what you're doing. If the Jews made Pilate commit himself on Jesus, then he was going to shame them and let them symbolically know that though they were doing all this, this is what I think of you. He'd mutilate and murder only if Jesus' accusers were threatened by the sign Pilate put over Jesus on the cross. Pilate, again, has a very common human disease. He shames and abuses those so that he can blame them for whatever it is that he fears. Whenever you see cruelty like that, you can usually find fear underneath it, can't you? And when that doesn't work and they yell, crucify, crucify all the more, he learns that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and then he gets really afraid. Time for a second interview. Jesus goes back into the praetorium with Pilate. And Pilate asks, just where do you come from? That question could mean, are you a Galilean? Or it could mean, where do you come from? Do you come really from heaven? And so it can be read as Pilate's own personal worry that he was messing around with a spiritual thing that he didn't understand. And the text cries out for Jesus to say, I come from heaven. I'm the glory of God returning to Zion. But Jesus says nothing. And Pilate can't understand why Jesus will not help Pilate set him free. Don't you understand that I have the power of life and death? Work with me here, Jesus. Help me stick it to these guys. So Pilate understands and he respects and he fears worldly power. Yeah? He understands coercion. He understands threat. He understands political power and political authority, but in this instance, he rather quietly lets it slip that he seems afraid of where Jesus may have come from. He's afraid of the kind of spiritual power that Jesus is seeming to wield, and Jesus makes it clear that the transcendent power is the only power that has given Pilate any power at all. And from that point, John tells us Pilate overtly tries to free Jesus like he's been subtly trying to free Jesus all along. But the Jews understand that Pilate fears his boss. Pilate is scared to death of Caesar. As if Caesar had the final say about Pilate. Pilate is in a fearful and reactive and frustrated state then, and he tries mocking Jesus' accusers again, and he tries to humiliate them by humiliating Jesus. Here's your king. The NIV translates in verse 13, like most scholars think it means, that Pilate went out and sat down on the bema, sat down on the judge's chair. But the Greek can just as easily mean that he placed Jesus on the bema. And he sat Jesus in that chair. I don't claim that that's the right interpretation, but it's possible. Here's the guy who's really capable of being in charge. Are you kidding me? Either way, Pilate is saying that this whole thing is stupid. Behold, here's your king. Shall I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar, they say. And so Pilate has extracted a full capitulation from the Jewish priesthood. The Jewish priests have theologically said this: Israel has no place in the redemption of the world. Israel has no hope of anything other than the rule of Rome over Israel. We have no other Messiah. And in extracting that capitulation from the priesthood, he gives up Jesus. So in the end, we know that Pilate is going around living, worrying about losing his job, worrying about losing his pride of position and place, reputation and success. But there's one last thing I think that Pilate is scared of. It comes from a passage in Matthew. Matthew 27:19 says, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, maybe that's one reason to think that Jesus is standing and Pilate is sitting. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message. The Italian artist here has the wife having sent, there you go, Aaron. He's holding the message. He's holding the message. She sent him a message. Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, because I've suffered much from him in a dream today. If Pilate was worried about the signs of the spiritual world before, that message surely shocked him. Surely shook him up further. Jesus has climbed now into his wife's dreams. Jesus has climbed into that spot. Origen, a second century writer, just some 4, 5, or 6 generations later, confirms that the church believed and the church remembered that Pilate's wife had converted to Christianity. And I confess to you, church, that this is why I was just drawn to this passage over and over again this week. I kept asking myself, how in the world does John know what Pilate said to Jesus and Jesus said to Pilate? Jesus was, by noon, Jesus was unable to say much more than 1 or 2 word sentences, and by 3, he's dead. There's no record of Jesus ever saying anything about it after he's raised from the dead. It probably wasn't Jesus. Maybe it was the guards who were there in Pilate's inner sanctum, who were abusing Jesus and mocking him, and they admitted their sadism to somebody later on. I don't know. That's possible, even if it's unlikely. You can invent some of Pilate's wider household here, I suppose. We don't know who those people are. I don't know that the artist did either. But how did John finally find out what was said back in those private hallways? I can't prove it. I won't charge any extra for it, but I think it might be Pilate's wife. I think she talked to him about, Pilate, about what had just happened. And I think we know because of something like that. What does all this have to do with Easter and the difference that the resurrection makes? John seems to be telling us that resurrection has encouraged a different kind of spiritual perception and the courage to act on it. John goes in and he sees what? He sees an empty tomb and he what? He believes. He trusts. He sees the sign. I mean, it's not as imposing a sign, I suppose, in some ways, as your wife telling you, don't have anything to do with this righteous man. I've suffered much to him today in a dream. It might not be as imposing a sign as what Pilate had when he all of a sudden saw the demonic frenzy that all these people are in, shouting, "Crucify," a guy who's obviously innocent. I mean, it's not as big a sign as that. It's just an empty tomb. But John had seen an empty tomb about a week before. He'd saw unraveled grave clothes about a week before when Jesus had raised Lazarus, and it echoes, and John has the spiritual perception to see an empty hole in the ground and believe in the power of the resurrected Lord. Mary stays, even as Peter and John go back. Mary stays at the tomb and she's just entering in there and she sees angels. "Why are you crying, Mary?" "Well, they've taken my Lord away, and I don't know what they've done with him." I mean, she's looking for a corpse. And then the gardener comes by. He's back here. She's looking in. She kind of looks over to the side of her face and sees the gardener, and he asks her the same kind of questions. "Sir, if you're the gardener, you maybe know what they did with him. Tell me where they put him." And then the gardener says her name. And immediately, it's a sign, because she knows what it feels like to have the divine in Jesus Christ address her by name. And though she's not been paying attention to what he said thus far, it's not the sound of his voice so much as it's the feeling she gets when she hears her name uttered by the divine, and she says, "Rabboni," teacher. She recognizes it, and what does she do? She starts clinging to Jesus immediately. You keep following John. What kind of a difference does the resurrection make? Well, they're in Galilee, John chapter 20. They're fishing. And there's an old boy about 100 yards, about a football field's distance over there with a fire making breakfast. And he tells them in the boat, throw your nets a little over there to the right, and they catch 153 big ones. You ever catch 153 big ones at once? I've never been net fishing on Galilee. I don't know anything about this, but I know that when I catch 150, I have caught 153 bluegill at once, one at a time, till we ran out of bait. But they know what it feels like to have that happen. And what does John do? He catches a bunch of fish and he says, "It's the Lord." Peter grabs his cloak and he goes, what's he do? He goes swimming for breakfast, man. In other words, the resurrection makes it possible for you to see the signs that are around you. The resurrection makes it possible for you to live in hope and in trust rather than Pilate's kind of fear. Because if you're constantly stalked by fear, and fear is the only way that you see the world, you can have sign after sign after sign come beating you right in the face. And you'll still act like a coward. That's what the resurrection does. It tells us, you know, everything is going to finally be okay. No matter what bad thing you might fear, God has got this. He's got the whole situation firmly in hand, and He's going to see that you get through it. And even though you may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you can fear no evil because He's gone there with you. He's gone through it with you. And He'll take you out on the other side. Amen. That makes a difference. So I implore you today, be the kind of person that wants to take the last shot. Don't be afraid of responsibility. Be the kind of person, right, that is not afraid of people. Be the kind of person that is not afraid of the authorities and afraid constantly of all kinds of stuff. Don't be the kind of person that Pilate was, scared, wanting to do right, but afraid of doing right because he's afraid of what that might mean and what that might cost him. Yeah? That's the difference I think resurrection makes today. And if that's the kind of difference you want in your life, we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing.